Right. I'm now going to give a longer version of a talk I just gave in London yesterday, 19th of September. Back home now. My talk was a 20-minute talk. This is probably going to be an hour or so because there are a number of slides I didn't show the audience, and I want to go through things more slowly, obviously. So I was asked to tell something about the case of Lucia de Berk in the Netherlands, and of course compare it compare it to the Lucy Letby case. So here's the timeline of Lucia de Berk, the Lucia de Berk case. In the Netherlands, we talk about Lucia de Berk because we don't use somebody's we don't use the surname. We don't publish the surname of an accused during the trial. So as far as the public is concerned, one could say that the case started with the death of a baby Amber, at the Juliana Children's Hospital, JKZ, Juliana Kinder Ziekenhuis, Medium Care Unit number 1, on the 4th of September 2001. And that death triggered quite immediate, massive reaction. Lucia had been on duty in the night when the baby died, and the next morning things started happening. Lucia was actually immediately taken off hospital duty, and the police were called in immediately. Police investigation started. There were news reports, the usual news reports, expected news reports of terrible things having been happening at a hospital in The Hague, and a nurse being investigated. In December 2001, Lucia was arrested. Things went fast. Only 4 months later, and well, another 2 years of police investigation took place, resulting in a first trial of Lucia at a lower court in The Hague, and which Lucia got life sentences for a number of murders and attempted murders. The main evidence in that trial was statistical evidence. A statistician gave evidence that the number of events in her shifts was totally impossible to be chance. He presented a probability 1 in 342 million that this coincidence could have happened could be due to chance. Well, obviously 1 in 342 million events just don't happen. It was an impossible coincidence of her presence with suspicious events at the hospital, including a number of deaths. Both defense and prosecution appealed. Lucia claimed to be innocent. Prosecution actually had wanted to have her sentenced for convicted for more murders and more attempted murders. And very rapidly, a new trial took place at the higher court in 2004, and this resulted in success for the prosecution because Lucia was now convicted of more murders and more attempted murders, 7 murders and 3 attempts at murder. The main evidence was no longer statistical, and this was very remarkable since it had been basically the only evidence at the previous trial. Suddenly, the main evidence was irrefutable medical scientific evidence together with something called a chain argument. The chain argument is important. Let me explain it. The idea is that there's a chain of events being discussed in court one by one, starting with baby Amber, and then going backwards in time and also going to events earlier at another hospital. first of all, the death of baby Amber is studied carefully, and it is shown that baby Amber was murdered by Lucia, who claims to be innocent, but the proof shows she did it, so she's a liar. The proof depends on forensic evidence that the baby was poisoned with digoxin. Lucia had opportunity. She was the last nurse who'd been with the baby. She had a motive because she wrote strange things in her diary about a terrible compulsion which she had and which she gave into from time to time, and it was very unprofessional. I mean, it was something she did at her work, which she shouldn't do. And the judges, because this is an inquisitorial system with no jury, but with a board of 3 judges actually carrying out an inquiry, the judges decided that these writings in her diary, the compulsion she referred to, was simply a compulsion to murder patients. So that was her motive. She had the opportunity, and the baby was proven to have been poisoned with digoxin, and it must have been Lucia who had done it. Okay, now you know that baby Amber was murdered, and that Lucia is a liar, and you know she's a murderer. And then you go to the next case, and I forget if it was Achraf or Akram, but you go down a chain of cases, and each time you need less evidence to decide that that event must have been a murder by Lucia, because as you work down, the court described it as a train. There was a locomotive, that's Amber, and then there are a number of carriages or wagons, and as you work down the train, you need less evidence to decide, to be sure that Lucia must have done it. Now, in the year 2005, the case went up to the Supreme Court because the defense still thought that argued that some evidence had been forgotten about, and that other procedural matters, but this was turned down by the Supreme Court. And there's a story there, which I'm not going to, how the full life sentence, which he had got in 2004, was reverted to a plain life sentence. Rather curious. But also in 2005, whistleblowers started gaining the attention of the media, and I will tell you more about them in a moment. And in fact, one of them, or together, they wrote a book. It was authored, they published, the person who the written author of the book, Tom Derksen, was a philosopher of science, a professor, and he was he worked together with his sister, who was a medical specialist. They wrote it together, and of course the medical research was very much done by Tom Derksen's sister, Meta de No. This book came out, it was published. It was in the bookstores in 2005, and it basically showed that the Supreme Court's, the appeal court's arguments were false, and that actually statistical thinking and statistical reasoning were still really the heart of the case. Up to the fact that conclusions by medical experts were basically contaminated or deeply influenced by the fact that Lucia was always there when bad things happened, and this led some experts to decide that certain events were suspicious, which otherwise they would have not thought to be suspicious. They knew that Lucia was there, and this it was the clinching fact which made them decide that such and such an event was certainly suspicious. Anyway, you didn't need a statistician to see that Lucia's presence at all these events just simply couldn't be a coincidence. It was an impossible coincidence, in fact. You didn't need a statistician. Lucia herself couldn't understand it and couldn't explain it, but was aware of it. She knew that things kept happening when she was there, and she didn't understand that. She didn't have an explanation for it. That was used against her, of course. Now, it took from 2005 what seemed like 5 very long years to get the case reopened, and it was finally reopened successfully by an application to the Dutch analog of the CCRC. So an independent committee was given an application with well-documented reasoning why the convictions were unsafe. The investigative board or committee decided that indeed the case needed to be reopened. They actually commissioned some new toxicological research and some other new evaluations by new experts, and it was after a number of legal steps led to the case being reopened. I mean, repeated, a new trial, which didn't take so long at all now, and led to Lucia's complete exoneration. So the main activity and main things I'm going to talk about is going to be what went on at the Juliana Children's Hospital on that medium care unit over the period where Lucia was working there, which is a little bit less than a year, from October 2000 to September 2001. I remember baby Amber died on the 4th of September, and Lucia was fired. Essentially, police were brought in, and Lucia was very soon after charged with murders, both at that hospital and at several other hospitals, which I'll say a little bit about more later. So these are the things I want to look at, because these are some of the most notable similarities between the Lucia de Berk case and the Lucy Letby case, and they are clearly statistical issues. At least all statisticians will agree that these are statistical issues. Lawyers might disagree or have other opinions. As I said, in the 2004 trial and conviction, no statistician was used. It was not needed. Actually, it was not needed because it was obvious that there was a spike. And it was obvious that Lucia was always there when bad things happened. So you didn't need to do any statistics at all. But this does mean that the numbers involved, the number of coins, the number of events in Lucia's shifts, and generally the development in the number of deaths at that unit over the years were important data for the trial. So I'm going to ask the question, should that spike have actually been expected, or really could that have been expected? Could that have been expected? Should it have been expected by the doctors at the time? I will explain that it's, in retrospect, it should have been expected. And similarly in Lucy Letby's hospital. Is there an innocent explanation for the obvious association or correlation between, in our case, Lucia's presence and suspicious incidents? And there are a number of explanations, and I mean, there are a collection of explanations, because it is not terribly. It's not so simple. It's not so simple as you would think. Are deaths and collapses actually often so hard to explain? There's are things also to think about. So here's the data of the spike at Lucia's hospital. She was working, remember, from the last few months of 2000 up to well, from October 2000 to September 2001. So most of not most of, a bit less than half of the time in those two last years, 2000 and 2001, and it is sort of clear that deaths were suddenly happening. Well, there are more deaths in those 2 years than in the 2 preceding years. It looks like much more. Of course, a statistician will say, well, that need hardly be statistically significant, but it was noticeable. Everybody saw that. People noticed it and were worried by it, concerned by it. And of course, the most damning thing about those deaths in 2000 and 2001, so there are 5 of them, that actually 4 of the 5 all had occurred in the same 11-month period or 10-month period when Lucia was working there. 4 out of the 5 deaths, and they coincide with Lucia's presence in the hospital. Indeed, they occurred during her working hours. So there is a spike there, and actually there's already a coincidence of events with Lucia's presence. We're just talking about deaths now. I will show you that in a little while that the spike is not quite as clear as it seems, that there's something missing in this table, as you can see. What about earlier, the previous 2 years? Now, this is the statistical data, which together with a statistical calculation of a probability, a p-value, in fact, led to Lucia's conviction at the first trial in 2003. And you see here data from the 2 hospitals. The top one, the top 2x2 table, is the Juliana Children's Hospital again, October 2000 to September 2001. And during that time, there are 3 shifts in a day, 3 8-hour shifts, of course, a bit of overlap between the handover. But in that period, there are a total of about 1,000 shifts. There were 9 incidents, and an incident is meant to be here an event which was unexpected and difficult to explain. And I do write there was deliberately and emphasize it. At the time, it appeared to the doctors, especially the clinicians, that it was thought to be, felt to be, was said to be, was told to the police that it was unexpected and difficult to explain. It was unexpected, and they didn't understand why it happened, when it happened. And of course, a number of those 9 there are deaths. 4 of them are deaths. 4 of those incidents are deaths. Unexpected and difficult to explain deaths, according to the doctors. And all 9 incidents occur when Lucia is working, which is obviously terribly statistically significant if you do the usual statistical analysis here. This cannot be a coincidence. And of course, it is not a coincidence, and we will see a number of reasons, and we will see about 2 or 3 contributing to 2 or 3 reasons why it actually is not so surprising at all. It was a little bit surprising, but not so terribly surprising. Now, the bottom 2 tables are the same hospital, but 2 different wards, and only about 4 months this time. And it's a few years before the Red Cross Hospital, Rode Kruis Ziekenhuis, 2 wards, which are actually adjacent. And this is not a children's hospital anymore. This is a regular hospital. And these 2 wards are wards with terminally ill patients, basically. Many very, very old patients. And there are actually a lot of deaths on those 2 wards. Anyway, those two wards, incidents have been identified. 15 on Ward 42 and 5 on Ward 41. And notice that on Ward 41, that's the bottom of the table, there is just one time that Lucia works on Ward 41, and it coincides with a death. And this was a very significant death for a death, in fact. I think these incidents in these two wards are actually all deaths. A number of the incidents in the top table are become murder attempts. So the bottom two are deaths, and there's one death on the single occasion when Lucia is working, one suspicious death, I have to say. I mean, these are not all the deaths, these are the deaths which have been classified as incidents because unexpected and difficult to explain. So that one there is very important because that one is actually a very aged Chinese judge, terminally ill. I forget with what illness, but in his end of his life, and he had been a judge at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So this really upset the judges in Lucia's trial, clearly, but it's also significant because on the day that he died and Lucy had been there, she had written in her diary that she had again given way to terrible and very unprofessional compulsion about which she was so embarrassed, and which was what it was going to be a secret which she would take to her grave, she hoped. We later found out what it was. It was to read the tarot cards to terminally ill patients if she thought that they would benefit, could appreciate it. And she had a rapport with her patients very often, and they a number of times did appreciate, apparently, according to her, very much that she offered to do that. Of course, it was not something a nurse is supposed to do. In the middle one, we have 15 incidents, right, and Lucia is present at 40% of them, if I did my calculations right. But again, she worked there are about 400 shifts, and she works about a sixth of them, which is what you would expect. So the proportion of incidents in her shifts is definitely, it is statistically significant. Numbers are smaller here, so it's not so exciting as the top one. So I'll come back to what the one in 342 million was, because you might be wondering whether that calculation was correct or not. But here is just to say, now let's look at Lucy Letby and quickly go through those same questions. Was there a spike? Should the spike have been expected? But I mean, could it have been expected? And indeed, should it have been expected? And is there an innocent association, explanation for the association? And the fourth question there, I won't say so much about it. But anyway, here's the spike, and this is well known to many of the people working on the Lucy Letby case. Certainly, it seems that in 2015 and 2016, there were surprisingly many early neonatal deaths on the neonatal intensive care unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, and people noticed and were concerned about them. And Lucy Letby was working full-time and was actually the most qualified nurse on the unit, even despite her very young age, because they'd fired all the more expensive older nurses. She was working all of 2015 on the unit and half of 2016. So there is a spike in deaths while Lucy is coinciding with Lucy's work on the unit. And how come unexpected? This is a table based on a statistical calculation, which is, I understand it's partly reverse engineered, but it's based on making very reasonable assumptions about what were the numbers of patients and the numbers with low birth weight, and similarly the numbers of patients and the numbers with highly premature, on the basis of guesstimates of those proportions and numbers, and using data, publicly available data from NHS statistics of maternity units in the in England and Wales, or maybe the whole United Kingdom. You can see that the number of deaths which actually happened, the neonatal mortality at the Countess of Chester in 2015 and in 2016 was not terribly different from what should have been expected. Certainly, retrospectively, could easily have been expected, because we have we have more years of data now in 2024 than was available in 2015 and 2016. But it is absolutely clear that the hospital was admitting more severely, more very vulnerable babies of very low birth weights, of very high degree of prematurity in 2015 and halfway into 2016. And this already started in 2014. We even know a reason why this happens, connected to closing of maternity units or intensive care facilities in maternity units in small hospitals in North Wales. There are reasons of NHS policy for this increase. There are other reasons too. The unit was caring for much more acutely ill babies who were much more likely to die, and many more did. And it seems to me that the clinicians at the hospital should have known that and could have predicted it. Here's a slide with some story about my own guess about a reason for this. It's important to realize that the hospital, it had the maternity unit and the neonatal unit, maternity services as a whole at the Countess of Chester. There were ambitions in the hospital to expand. Unfortunately, these ambitions were somewhat thwarted by continued reduction in money, cutting of funding, which which was taken care of by getting rid of senior qualified nurses, for instance. So the neonatal unit was actually staffed and equipped as a level 1 unit, even though it was on paper a level 2 unit. It was taking babies which were definitely needed to be cared for in a level 2, a good level 2, if not a good level 3 unit. I think of premature triplets and twins. This was totally out of the reach of what Countess of Chester had. And not surprisingly, there were many deaths and other untoward incidents occurring to those babies. The thing is, the higher the acuity, the more the hospital gets paid by the NHS for treating those patients, probably on a per day basis. So treating those severely ill babies did give an enormous boost in income to the hospital, which was struggling to get by. It had a great big deficit. And there are historical reasons for, well, there's a history of the NHS here, which is worth investigating, and also very interesting personal connections between the board of the trust, which is different from the executive committee of the hospital. The trust is something bigger, and it has its own board, a higher level of management than the executive committee of the running the hospital itself. And there's interesting personal connections there between the membership of that board and the past history of the NHS. So everybody's seen this, and I'm not going to spend time on it now. Actually, I did add some annotations into it, which I think are important, but I want to only briefly show you a version of the spreadsheet which I prefer, where I've ordered the nurses by the time at which they first appear on the hospital in the spreadsheet, or the number of the event, right? So there were 7 nurses present during the shift at which baby A died, and for which Lucy Letby was found guilty of murdering that baby. And so they are the first 7, and those first 7 are in alphabetical order, and Lucy is the middle one of them, and the rest of the table is just the table we saw before, just quite simply reordered. And I've thought of some further ways I'd like to improve this idea. What I really want to show is the interval between the first and the last X in each column. And you will see that there are very striking differences between nurses. There are a number of nurses who are present at the beginning and present at the end, and often present from time to time during this, actually 18 months, because data started, investigation was focused on all of 2015 and the first half of 2016. But okay, the first suspicious event was in June 2015. So it looks like a shorter period. That as you move through from left to right, you see quite clearly many nurses who are only present for a short period at the hospital, it seems. Of course, maybe they were at the hospital all the time, but it seems likely that the number of nurses are only there for shorter periods. And we do actually know that about half of these 38 nurses are actually bank nurses. This means nurses who have been previously fired, but who are willing to come back again from time to time, or are previously left working at the hospital, okay, but are prepared to come back from time to time if extra nursing staff is needed, and agency nurses. A lot of these nurses are agency nurses who come in when the ward is understaffed as far as the nursing is concerned, which often happens because from time to time it's peak activity on the unit, and more serious cases requiring more nurses, and they're simply not there, and they have to be got from elsewhere, and that costs more money. What you also see here are the vertical clusters, that you see the events rapidly in succession, and little blocks, which also coincide very nicely with horizontal blocks, where we see that the triplets and the the triplet and the twins, leading to vertical blocks of X's, and the same nurses being there several times in succession. Okay, I'm not going to talk more about this, about the Lucy Letby side of this now. And at the meeting in London, there was a lot more said about it, of course. My purpose is to talk about Lucia de Berk. So let's go back to Lucia de Berk. And what I want to do in the rest of the talk is walk through the timeline again. But this time, my timeline will start a bit earlier. It will start before the first event of Lucia de Berk. It will start when Lucia starts working on that unit, and indeed a little bit earlier than that too. And we will think about those questions yet again. So there are a number of phases to be distinguished. In fact, there is an emergent suspicion emerges in the hospital. There may or may not be hospital investigations. There may or may not be medical investigations commissioned by the hospital, but done by external agencies or authorities. There's going to be a trigger event which sends people to the police. And that is a little bit different in the Lucia case from well, there are a number of differences here between Lucia de Berk and Lucy Letby. Anyway, at some point, police called in and we get a police investigation. Then there are trials. And as we see now, starting in the Lucy Letby case, what looks like a campaign for reopening a closed case, and a growing chorus of voices claiming that convictions are not safe, and some people even daring to say that they believe Lucia is innocent. And of course, that is my personal opinion, and it's I can give you my arguments. Even I can do a Bayesian calculation using Bayes' theorem, starting from a reasonable prior and then putting in likelihood ratios for a number of pieces of evidence or blocks of evidence, which I think can be thought of independently of one another, and ending up with, for me, near certainty, but always open, of course, to change by new information. Then, yes, a campaign may lead to new inquiries or official legal inquiries, may lead to a retrial. That may lead to a retrial, that may lead to exoneration of the nurse. That's certainly what happened in the Lucia de Berk case, which is, of course, what I'm mostly talking about right now. So at the Juliana Children's Hospital, there seemed to be a spike. Nurses and doctors thought there was a spike, and nurses and doctors were worried by it, and presumably management as well. We know that so this was a children's hospital. The chief pediatrician seems to have been working very closely with the management of the hospital. So this is a little bit different from Lucy Letby, where it seems that management and clinical leadership disagreed. But here they acted very much in concert from the start, maybe from before the start, in some sense. There was gossip about a particular nurse, and the particular nurse was, of course, Lucia. And I won't go into what the gossip was, but she was a very notable nurse who stood out in the crowd, who wasn't afraid to speak her mind when she saw things which she thought was wrong. Many of her colleagues liked her very much. Some were fearful of her and found her scary. So there was that gossip going around. And the nurse herself was actually, Lucia, was worried about the events which kept happening, it seemed, when she was there. And she told her superiors, as well as, it was talked about with her between the nursing staff. But she also told the matron, and she was given advice, kind advice. These things can happen. It happens to some of us, and it doesn't happen at all to others. And it's just how things are. Don't worry. Take a day off. It'll pass. This can happen. But we know that doctors were starting to compile the dossiers concerning suspicious events and sharing, and in particular the suspicious events, which they already connected to the suspicious nurse. So there was a suspicious nurse, and her presence at events which were perhaps unexpected and perhaps difficult to understand, or seemed unexpected and seemed difficult to understand at the time, they were being linked to Lucia de Berk. And it's pretty clear that at some point there was a kind of a lull, but they were waiting, management and clinical management to clinical leadership, the senior pediatrician of the hospital, were basically waiting for Lucia to strike again. And Amber died, and that was it, because the very next day, police were called in, and Lucia was suspended, and the medical dossiers of 9 suspicious events were there. Okay, so one of them was that of baby Amber, and the other 8, it seems, must have already been ready and waiting. And well, the usual things happened. So that death of baby Amber was the trigger to the police investigation into Lucia as a possible killer. And the hospital went to the police with not only the events which they thought were murders, but also with the person who they thought was the murderer, very clearly identified. Of course, in the Countess of Chester, things were rather different, because actually the hospital halfway through 2016, both the hospital management and the clinical management of the clinical leadership of the hospital, the senior pediatricians, agreed that there was something bad going on, and Lucy was taken off patient care, given some administrative tasks, which she complained strongly about, by the way. And the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health was called in. So this is what I think is the right thing that should have happened. Bring in external, independent medical experts and let them study what is going on here. And as we know, the report was prepared, and it recommended some further investigation, and that happened. And that investigation investigator recommended a further investigation of just a few events, and that also happened. And all those investigations, they essentially cleared the nurses and even cleared Lucy explicitly. But at some point it had to be published. A redacted version was published, and that was the point where we are told by the doctors themselves, when the report came out, we knew it was us or her, and that was the reason they went to the police. Of course, they convinced the management to let them go to the police, but so they did, and they went to the police. Presumably the senior pediatricians collected the medical data which was taken to the police. We know they also took an earlier version of the spreadsheet. The earlier version had even been compiled in the hospital and shown to management earlier, before the RCPCH came in. So the idea that events were connected to Lucy had been around for quite a while, and that spreadsheet had a long prehistory. Back to, of course, continuing with the Netherlands and Lucia de Berk, the director of the Juliana Children's Hospital immediately called all his fellow directors at the other hospitals where Lucia was known to have worked, all in The Hague, or basically in The Hague, and basically asking how many, but basically saying, we've caught a serial killer and it's terrible, and she used to work at your place. Are there any people she killed? Did she kill patients at your hospital too? And this succeeded in delivering those events at the RKZ, the Red Cross Hospital, which you saw in the spreadsheet. PIS is the hospital connected to the prison at Scheveningen, Penitentiaire Inrichtingen Scheveningen. And there's another hospital, Leijenberg, which didn't provide any convictions. So the JKZ and the RKZ hospitals provided the finally decided murders and murder attempts. But all the time, the story was she killed many, many, many more patients, both at those hospitals and at the other ones. So right at the beginning of the police coming in, there was that 2x2 table at the Juliana Children's Hospital, and the probability of the p-value of that table, well, you can calculate it yourself if you're a statistician, but it's fairly impressive, of course. And it took a while for the police to become convinced, unlike in Lucy Letby case, it took a while for the police to really believe that there was something worth investigating here, and they were convinced when a new police and a new inspector was police inspector was put in charge of the investigation. He was convinced by talking to the statistician who did that probability calculation, which I've mentioned. And who later became the chief prosecution witness. Okay, so that's similar to Lucy Letby, because we know that the spreadsheet basically convinced the police. The spreadsheet and the spike convinced the police inspector in 10 minutes, as he has said himself. The chief pediatrician at the Juliana Children's Hospital continued to coach the police investigation, certainly that at her hospital. And she was a very influential person in Dutch medicine, rather well known, admired indeed, important, very many important friends. I'm not going to talk about the difference between the adversarial system and the inquisitorial system. Of course, 3 judges running an inquiry is somewhat different from the adversarial system with 2 barristers holding a wrestling match and being observed by 12 ordinary people. I think the differences are not as strong as they appear. Of course, many things are different in Great Britain than in the Netherlands, and also in over 20 years, many things have changed. But let's leave that for those who want to discuss it. I'll leave it out of my discussion now. Here's a beautiful parallel between the 2 cases. The 3 smoking guns. Basically, there are 3 smoking guns. I'm combining the spike and the coincidence into one. The spreadsheet in the Lucy Letby case, and the spike and those 2x2 tables in the Lucia de Berk case. Then in the Lucia de Berk case, there are sinister writings in a diary, somewhat analogous to the post-it notes of Lucy Letby. And then there's the fact that there's just one case where there seems to be very powerful, independent, scientific evidence that the baby has been murdered or attacked. Digoxin poisoning of baby Amber in the Lucia de Berk case, and of course the insulin cases in the Lucy Letby case. And then there are many more similarities, because in the Lucia de Berk case, there is a mass of circumstantial evidence which took a great deal of time to be gone through in court, in what was basically an inquiry, as I said, but it was painstakingly all the evidence which the prosecution brought was investigated by the judges, the board of 3 judges, and of course the defense had their say again and again and again. So there was items at home which came from the hospital. There were sinister choice of books of Lucia, sinister preference for night shifts, and many, many, many more details. Somehow giving the same impression that there really is very little evidence at all, and there's a kind of a smokescreen of things which are really rather inconsequential, but given a sinister interpretation. Okay, so as I said, about the time that Lucia was definitively in jail for life, a campaign started to get a retrial by submitting an application with her lawyers to the Dutch version of the CCRC. In the Netherlands, it's the CEAS, Commissie Evaluatie Afgesloten Strafzaken. So, Committee for Evaluation of Closed Cases, definitively closed cases. And actually, the Dutch version was brought in under political pressure after a number of obvious miscarriages of justice, just as the British CCRC. The same, the same problems were happening in the 2 countries. And the campaign was led by, people say I shouldn't call it a campaign, but one wanted to get a retrial. And it's clear that one has to have public support for that and gain public support for that, as well as gain professional support in medicine and law. And I'm not ashamed to call it a campaign. But of course, it is a campaign which has two parts. There is a careful, methodical, very proper, scientific, respectable route, going through the legal route, which is there, the CEAS or the CCRC, and that is also necessary, absolutely necessary, to change public opinion, because the Netherlands public was convinced that Lucy Letby was a terrible killer, and this meant not the medical world was convinced, the legal world was convinced, most people were convinced, journalists were convinced, the newspapers were convinced. So this had to change, this had to be changed. And statisticians were very rapidly involved. And it became very important to destroy the myth of the 101 in 342 million. Let me say why it was a myth, because it turned out to be, in part, based on a very bad mistake. 3 p-values were multiplied, and the usual way of combining 3 p-values would have given a result of 1 in 10,000, maybe thousands, but not millions, not in hundreds of millions. That was an incredible, and that was and to do this, by the way, it was necessary to get hold of the original statistician's report to the court, which till then had not been public. So I'm kind of ashamed that we never actually asked at the time of the trials, at the first time of the first trial, how that number had been calculated. But we were given a false sense of false security, because we were told at the second trial that there was no statistics in there anymore. And anyway, the numbers are obvious. You've seen the numbers, the raw numbers. They show amazing coincidence, certainly at Juliana Children's Hospital. And the spike was also obvious. I mean, maybe a small spike, but 4 or 5 deaths in Lucia's shifts in 2 years, even though she was only working there for 10 or 11 months, is striking, whether or not terribly statistically significant. It turned out that just as in the Lucy Letby case, and here, thanks especially to Meta Deneau, the medical side of the team of the whistleblowers, it was possible to identify events which had happened at the Juliana Children's Hospital and also at RKZ, which were absolutely similar to events which had been classified as incidents, as suspicious and unexpected and inexplicable. Just the same event. It happened a number of times to the same patient. It was part of a sequence. A patient was having repeated attacks of some kind, collapses, and they were all just the same. The only difference was that Lucia was present sometimes and not at other times, and Lucia was suspicious, and that made certain of those events suspicious and the others not. So there were admitted events. You put in the events which one could uncover, which seem to have been which should have been treated as suspicious as the others, and the p-value of the combination of the 3 tables plummeted again by factor 100 or something. Then take some account of heterogeneity. I mean, the 3 hospitals are different. Sorry, the 2 hospitals are rather different. Night and day is different. Different times of year may well be different. Nurses are different. Those tables just suppose that all nurses are the same, but they're not. We know that Lucy was working longer hours and harder shifts, and more often there than other nurses. And nurses are not all the same. So there's all kinds of heterogeneity and hidden confounders, which we know or we understand must be confounders, but they haven't been measured. They're not registered in the data which we have, because we only have that summary statistic of those 2x2 tables. You do take account of everything, and it comes down, and I end up with 1 in 50, and sometimes other numbers, because there's some simple guesswork involved here, much like Peter Elston's reconstruction of those expected numbers of events in those 2 years, when you take account of the acuity of the babies, of the cases. So there's some guesswork, educated guesswork involved, and I think 1 in 50 is a reasonable p-value for how amazing it is, well, for how big that coincidence is of Lucia's presence at all those events. So she was indeed there more often than you could expect, perhaps by chance, but it wasn't so terribly much. It could happen. I mean, 1 in 50 does happen all the time. The campaign to get a retrial had 2 prongs, and I think I've already said this in part. I want to emphasize it. It was very important that there should be a very careful, serious, objective, academic process, always very carefully only saying that there seems to be evidence that the convictions are unsafe, and therefore the retrial is needed. But at the same time, there is a public campaign where journalists are journalists get interested, start writing articles, TV interviews, there's a website, there's a petition, there was a demonstration, and people working on that side, including myself, were not ashamed to say that they believed that Lucia was completely innocent. Now, they were not saying that Lucia was fitted up. We were not saying that there was some sort of conspiracy. All the time, we are careful to say that we believe that everybody was acting out of the best possible intentions and motives, and had sincere concerns and thought they were doing the right thing. But they were making mistakes, and they were influenced by all the biases which we talk about in our report. The investigations were unsafe investigations, and the Royal Statistical Society's report, the report which I was a co-author of, which the Royal Statistical Society supports, is basically saying that in both cases the investigations were badly flawed and therefore liable to producing results which are not reliable. Liable to getting results which are not reliable and which could easily contribute to unsafe convictions. By the way, it took journalists to find out what the cause of the spike was at the Lucia de Berk case. There had been a change in hospital policy. It was not widely known, but the idea was that it was a high-level decision to transfer very sick children faster out of intensive care into medium intensive care in order to go home faster. And many of these children, many of whom had inborn genetic problems and were actually could never be expected to have much of a life, and certainly not a long life. That part of the idea was that death should happen at home rather than in the hospital. And unfortunately, the policy change misfired because the deaths started happening in the medium intensive care unit. Now, at the trial, the director of the hospital had given evidence, and he had actually said, "We have never seen so many deaths on this unit before." And the reason he could say that, and it was in some sense a true statement, because he had given the unit a different name 2 years earlier. And now I have just filled in 2 missing numbers there. And you see that in the years 1996 and 1997, there were 6 deaths. In those 2 years, there were 6 deaths on what was essentially the same unit. And compare that to the 5 in 2000 and 2001. So a campaign a public campaign is important because it actually generates information, data, facts, and understanding into what was going on, which is very, very, very crucial and very important, and can certainly be used at a retrial. Well, I think I'd talked quite enough about those tables, and so I will carry on from here. I'm not quite sure why I put it here again, but as I said, there events are missing. There are hidden confounders, many hidden confounders. I don't think I want to say much here, but it's a fact that while trying to be a person noticeable in public life, calling for a retrial, one gets a lot of nasty reactions. And most important, well, there are 2 things I want to say which are important here. The enormous problem of cases like these is that there's never really going to be new evidence. there are going to be perhaps improved or strengthened scientific opinions about concerning the meaning of existing evidence. And that's how it is. If you admit that miscarriages of justice can happen because the experts used in the initial trial were not the best experts, it's going to be hard for the legal establishment to consider just another new scientist as being providing new evidence, new facts. That's part of the reason why a public campaign is necessary, because the public has to be the public has to be convinced that there needs to be a retrial. The Guildford 4 and Liverpool 6, those cases and numerous others in England would never have been reopened without a powerful public campaign which went on for a long time and was strongly resisted by the establishment, you could say. I'm not saying that the establishment isn't having some conspiracy, but it is following the rules and bound by the rules, which is said itself. And of course, it is going to be very embarrassing to the establishment when it turns out that revered and very important, iconic institutions turn out to have made mistakes. But if they have made mistakes, they need to be admitted. And because only by admitting to mistakes can you learn from them. And if you don't learn from them, then they're going to be repeated. So part of the public campaign for Lucia de Berk, part of its weight was that scientists, including a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, signed a petition to have the case reopened. And by the way, that scientist's wife was a nurse, a doctor, and his two daughters were a doctor, and he spent a weekend thinking about whether or not he would sign our petition. And when he did, he wrote a beautiful and powerful, cogent motivation for his signature on our petition, which which was good for the journalists and for the current affairs programs. And even the foreign newspapers, the New York Times, noticed that a Nobel Prize-winning physicist had signed this petition in the Netherlands. And all this put pressure on the system to not to free Lucia de Berk just like that. No. But to make sure that the good people, in the sense of careful, thorough, and somewhat independent-minded legal people, were put in charge of the application to the CCRC. And a couple further legal steps, the choice of the court at which the retrial was held, for instance. Now, I would love to tell more and more. I would love to tell more about this in particular, but there are all kinds of social connections between persons, and they are unfortunately, or actually fortunately, they exist. People have connections with one another. Personal connections were possibly playing an insidious role in the beginning of the Lucia de Berk case, running up to her conviction, and I have very powerful evidence for that, which I'm not going to talk about in this talk. But later, similar connections, personal connections, sort of random chance connections between, who's married to who and who knows who at what social organizations, social networks, all can be used and have to be used in the phase of trying to convince the system to allow a retrial. As I said, I think I've said everything which is written on this slide, or more or less. It was important. It was important that in the Lucia de Berk case that the toxicologist who had concluded that baby Amber had died of digoxin poisoning, which the digoxin must have been administered recently, he actually supported the findings of a new toxicologist who said that digoxin had leaked out of the organs where it had been stored due to its use in earlier treatment of baby Amber, who had a number of heart operations and was recovering from the latest one. And personal interactions between various persons played a role in getting in played a role in the willingness of the old toxicologist to agree with the new one, which was could have been an important part of the decision of the Supreme Court to follow the advice of the Dutch CCRC to reopen the case, to have allowed the case to be reopened, to be retried. And at the end of the day, in the Lucia de Berk case, we now widely agree in the Netherlands that it was the biggest miscarriage of justice in many years. And there's some evidence that here's some evidence that the system definitely recognized that fact in a quite public way. And the fact that it was very publicly recognized also allowed the system actually indeed to learn from the mistakes. Various reforms did take place and indubitably have made a recurrence of a case like this less likely in the Netherlands in future. Better screening of experts, more care, more interest in the legal community for finding out what statistics is about. Various things have changed and have changed for the better. So that's also some compensation to the terrible time that Lucia de Berk had. Not full compensation at all, but anyway. I have a second final slide where I wanted to argue that it would be good for the Royal Statistical Society to support a call which has been made for a Royal Commission. There was a letter from a group of nurses, and it has been signed by a large number of healthcare professionals in England, in the United Kingdom. It's a letter to the Prime Minister, and it's been sent also to, or will be sent to, I don't know if it's arrived yet, to the relevant secretaries of state of the relevant ministries. And there are some reasons why perhaps a Royal Commission is a good way to go, though other people have said to me, actually, it could be just a way to make things go even more slowly and delay the final reckoning, which is going to come, I believe. I believe it's inevitable, but I think it's going to take a long time. Okay, so that's the end of the talk, and I will now stop the recording.